Hello, welcome everyone to the Heal PA learning session. It's glad to see everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it because we have a lot to cover today. This meeting is being recorded, and everybody will get a copy of the recording after we're all done. Give it maybe about a day or two to make sure we have everything set up. Also, if you have a moment, I would really appreciate if everyone that's here can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from. If you can put some contact information in there too, that will really help us. Just in case we have questions and we can't get to everybody's questions, we know who to follow up with. So name, organization, and your contact information would be wonderful. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Amanda McNaughton. I am with United Way of Pennsylvania. I'm the staff liaison for Resilient PA. If you haven't heard of Resilient PA before, what we are is a grassroots coalition that is focused on bringing together all of the regional trauma-informed professionals and giving them one place to come together and share information, network, and collaborate. The United Way Network has been really involved in these grassroots trauma-informed coalitions across the state. We were actually funded through a grant by United Way of Greater Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey to create this coalition. And we started that in 2020, which was the perfect time to be kind of starting this work because now it's front and center in everybody's mind. Our goals are really to connect all the local communities, give them a place to share information and resources and network. We are highlighting and sharing local best practices in trauma-informed care systems and communities, helping to provide standardized language and tips to engage business leaders and elected officials as champions for trauma-informed care, acting as a unifying and magnifying vehicle for communities and trauma-informed care champions to advocate for trauma-informed and resiliency building policies, practices, and funding. And we have a close partnership, which has really benefited us a lot with Heal PA and all of their experts who can help create these kind of resources, and Resilient PA can help get them out to the people who need to see them. So just a little bit about how we work with Heal PA, because I know that it can be a little bit confusing. Resilient PA and Heal PA both promote trauma-aware systems and trauma-informed care across Pennsylvania by raising awareness about the effects of trauma and promoting efforts to reduce the risk factors and increase protective factors. We can break cycles of family and community trauma for all Pennsylvanians. Heal PA is really composed of leading experts, sharing knowledge and creating educational resources, while Resilient PA serves as a grassroots connector for local trauma-informed coalitions and is also the communications vehicle from Heal PA into Pennsylvania communities. Together, we work with other partner organizations to foster coalitions in our communities that help us grow, become more resilient, and create a healing culture throughout the state. To do that, we've actually come up with some really great things that we are doing. I have our website here. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat as well. I also have another link that I'm going to direct you to very shortly. Anyone can sign up at Resilient PA for an account. You can go in, log in, you have access to a whole bunch of resources, including the Trauma-Informed Community Series, which is one of the best things that we have done recently. And this was in partnership with the Pennsylvania Office of Advocacy and Reform, Heal PA, and Collectively Rooted, who generously donated a lot of time, effort, and resources into creating an on-demand, free professional development opportunity. It's a 7.5-hour trauma training series that focuses on where and how trauma appears in our communities, what happens when we experience trauma, the role of community in healing, and how we can heal ourselves and support healing in others. And I see that some people have taken the training. It's really amazing. The speakers for this training are out of this world. It's actually my next slide. We had some great speakers for this training. We had Bessel van der Kolk, who literally wrote the book on trauma, it seems. When I was in school, I took a lot of classes where his book was recommended reading. We also have Darren Young, Linda Ty, and Talisa Ramos-Watts. And that's all the sessions that they did for us. They said it's about 7.5 hours of training. It's on demand, so you can really start and stop it and pause it and kind of go about your day and fit it in when you have time. So it's really accessible. And there are CE credits available for different licenses. I didn't list all the licenses available here. They are on the website, which I'm also going to put in here so that people can go directly to it. It's free, it's on demand. All you have to do is sign up for the program and sign up for a resilientpa.org account. And then you are able to take that course. We also have some really cool stuff coming in the pipeline. Very soon, Heal PA and Collectively Rooted are launching a lunchtime, like a lunch and learn series. That should be going live here by the end of this week. We're just waiting to finalize a couple of details. And everybody that's signed up for resilientpa.org will be getting information when those go live. And we'll be doing one of those a month. We have more excellent speakers lined up to do that as well, including Bessel van der Kolk and some other really important authors who have done a lot of work in trauma-informed care. So that's in the pipeline. It's not quite ready yet. I was hoping it would be ready by today. Not quite yet. And you will be able to have first access to registration for that when it comes out. I do have my contact information here. I'm going to go ahead and pop it into the chat as well when I'm done speaking so that everybody has it. But if you ever have any questions or want to reach out and get more involved in Resilient PA, I would be glad to talk to anyone. So I know I only had a couple minutes to go ahead and introduce myself. Does anyone have any very quick questions? All right, hearing none, I'm going to go ahead and pop my contact information over into the chat. And Ramona, I think that you wanted to go ahead and introduce Father Paul.
Yes, Father Paul, I've got an introduction for you. So I want to first of all welcome you all to our second Heal PA session of this type. And again, make sure you put your contact information in there so that we can stay connected with you. So I'm grateful for each and every one of you taking up your time today to learn, for us to learn together. While I would like to believe that all of y'all came on today because I was moderating, I know that is not the truth. So I know you all came to hear Father Paul. So I want to read a little bit about him. In case some of you may not know, he is an Orthodox Christian priest. He works in a predominantly Black underserved community in Pittsburgh. And Father Paul is also a combat veteran of the Iraq War. So thank you, sir, for your service. He realized that trauma in the form of hunger, abuse, homelessness, lack of opportunity, lack of health care, racism, violence, greatly informed the worldview of those living in these communities. And Father Paul began to ask this question: how do you heal an entire community that has been inundated with this type of trauma for generations? And what he said to himself, I think, was, you got to start where you are. For Father Paul, that start was, he is the founder and the CEO of the Neighborhood Reslience Project. And he's the builder of their trauma-informed community development framework. And so I don't know about y'all, but to have him in our presence today is an honor. Father Paul. Thank you.
Ramona, thank you so much for such a kind and gracious introduction. And to Amanda and the team with United Way, I'm so grateful for the invitation to be with you in Resilient PA. And certainly we celebrate the work of the United Way, and we celebrate the work of collectively our Commonwealth. This is a time in which there are many Pennsylvanians who are coming forward, who believe that we can have a better Pennsylvania, a Pennsylvania that is more healthy, a Pennsylvania that is more equitable, more just, a Pennsylvania that is more fitting for our children and our grandchildren. And so it is a great honor for me to be with all of you here today. We're going to discuss trauma-informed community development and give a brief overview. And I'm hoping that not only will I have an opportunity to share a little bit about the Neighborhood Reslience Project and the work that we are doing, but also to offer some thoughts and some encouragement as to how we might do this kind of work across the Commonwealth, no matter what community we are in. There are many different types of trauma in this, and there are some communities in our Commonwealth that have a disproportionate experience of trauma. That is to say that they experience trauma more at a higher rate than much the rest of our state. So we're going to discuss, reflect and discuss on some of these themes here today. So to begin, certainly you will see the mission statement of the Neighborhood Resilience Project. You will see that we are faith-based. There are many faith-based organizations that are doing extraordinary work in many of our communities. You'll see we claim a connection to the civil rights movement as well. And you'll see that the mission of the Neighborhood Resilience Project is to support the transformation of neighborhoods from what we call trauma-affected communities to resilient, healing, and healthy communities through trauma-informed community development. We're offering two definitions of community here that I believe very strongly we should be able to acknowledge, we should be able to scientifically know if we are in one category or another. This idea of a trauma-affected community versus a resilient, healing, and healthy community. And we're going to discuss this a little bit today. As Ramona mentioned, my service in the Iraq War, there's informed some of my perspective on this. This photograph that you see on the screen here was taken very near to where I was in April of 2003. I crossed into Iraq in March of 2003, in the very first day of the ground war in Iraq with the Army's 3rd Infantry Division, and would go on to spend a year at war. And that was the time in my life where I learned of something I had not I was not before aware of, and that was post-traumatic stress disorder. This idea that we, because of this experience, our lives might be so shattered that we would be unable to reintegrate back into the communities we knew and loved so well. Now, I came home from the war, years went by. I got into the ministry. I got into doing this kind of work in my own community. And we, like a lot of faith-based organizations, we started out with a lot of just trying to do something positive for the neighborhood. Basic needs, food and clothing, maybe helping with little lights, gas, and rent, that sort of thing. But I learned very quickly when I was very young in my ministry that at least I suspected that I was seeing so much more post-traumatic stress disorder in my own community than I ever saw when I was in the Army. I realized that we went away, we spent 1 year at war for our country, but we had people in our communities that were essentially spending their entire lives at war. I realized that we had this kind of understanding that we were granting to veterans, rightfully so, coming home from war, veterans who we might say go on to be homeless, veterans who struggle holding down employment, but we had a completely different standard when we were talking about the children of our community who had to endure things that I saw when I was in the war. There was something about this that did not sit right with me. And I understood that this was the greatest challenge that we were facing in our community, that it was the extraordinary trauma that we had been facing, not just now, not just in one moment, not just in the life of an individual, but that our community had suffered this immense trauma for generations, and that this trauma became the foundation for the community worldview. Now, thinking about all of this, we began to ask ourselves the question, are people healthy enough to sustain opportunity? People were talking a lot about opportunities. They were talking a lot about creating opportunities, but we began to ask ourselves, are people healthy enough to sustain opportunity? We had early on a workforce development program that we ran in our community. And there was a young woman who was very, very bright. She was very motivated. She was very determined. She did very well in the program. And when she graduated from the program, it wasn't but a few days before she had gotten a job. And she showed up to work on time and she was doing well for 1 month. Then she came to me and she said, I've gotten another job. And then after another month, she said, I've gotten another job. And this pattern continued for a period of 2 years. And after that 2-year period, she came into my office and I sat her down and I said, I've noticed, I've seen you go from job to job to job to job over the last 2 years. You're very motivated, you're very talented, you're very, very intelligent, but this is not healthy. We can't go from one job to the next. We have to have some continuity. We've got to sustain this job for a little while. And she said to me, after a long pause, well, I've never said this to anyone before. I've been in therapy for years, and I've not even told my counselor this. But when I was 15 years old, I was in the foster care system. And I was in a home, I was placed in a home where there were 5 other males. And one day, those 5 males held me down and gang raped me. And every time I lost a job, it's because they had me working with men. Now that story perfectly illustrates why the traditional workforce development program is not enough for many people in our community. It is a much easier thing to create an opportunity than it is to help people become healthy enough to sustain that opportunity. And yet we knew that this was precisely the work. Now, many of us are familiar with the ACE study. Of course, we're in the trauma-informed realm, and we know that childhood trauma, just to revisit this, categorized into these 3 groups: abuse, household challenges, and neglect. Abuse, household challenges, and neglect. And of course, the original ACE study, conducted by Kaiser Permanente in 1997, was conducted on a predominantly white middle-class population. So the ACE study that we still look at here today, which of course, as we all know, anyone can take it. The ACE study, the original ACE questions, these are really designed for that population: abuse, household challenges, and neglect. And of course, the correlation is that the higher the experience of trauma before the age of 18, the more likely someone as an adult is going to have a negative impact on adult health and behavior. The more likely they're going to have cancer, COPD, diabetes, heart disease, but also the more trauma before the age of 18, the more likely they're going to suffer from chronic unemployment, homelessness, tobacco use, substance abuse. So there's a real impact not only on adult health as well as adult behavior, to include a lower life expectancy. Now, to be very clear, and this is where we sometimes really get this wrong when we talk about the ACE study, because it's not a sentence. It's not to say that if you experience this kind of trauma, that you will have a negative impact on adult health and behavior. We mustn't use it diagnostically. Of course, we understand this. It does, however, indicate particular risk. We have to be very careful how we use this. So there was a group of researchers from one of the local universities that went into one of our neighborhoods, a predominantly Black neighborhood. They were very excited to share the information about the ACE study. And they shared this information about the ACE study, and people from the community listened. At the end of a presentation, a woman raised her hand and she said, "So you're saying we're all messed up?" Sometimes this is how we use the ACE study. So you people have been through so much, there's just no hope. You people have been through so much, you're not going to be well. You've been through so much, you're going to smoke, you're going to drink, you're going to suffer from substance abuse. And of course, we mustn't communicate the results of the ACE study like that. It's the first point I want to make about the ACE study. The second point is this notion of racial bias in the ACE study, and where we have to talk about expanded ACEs. So, for example, as I had mentioned, the ACE test, the original ACE test only was designed for a predominantly white middle-class population. These are an example of 6 what we call expanded ACEs that were designed that had a more urban population in mind, a population of color, an urban-based population of color in mind. And this study was, and the ACE study was given in the city of Philadelphia. So this is in our state. That included not only the regular 10 questions of the ACE test, but it also included these 6 what we call expanded ACEs. Fascinatingly, 13.9% of respondents only had one of these expanded ACEs. So that is to say that if you use the regular ACE test on these folks, they would screen they would screen for no trauma, no experience of childhood trauma. And yet we look at this: witnessed violence, felt discrimination and bigotry, lived in an unsafe neighborhood, experienced bullying, lived in foster care or another youth congregate care setting, experienced poverty for an extended period of time. That here we see now we're expanding our understanding of childhood trauma. And we understood in our work that there was a high degree of childhood trauma. We actually, when we were starting out, we understood how important it was for us to have a scientific approach to this, to these challenges in community. And we also wanted to see if science validated our concerns. Now, at that particular time, back 2012, we didn't have this notion of expanded ACEs. We didn't have that vocabulary. And these were not, we were not aware of this. In fact, people weren't talking about this at that time. But we did have the ACE study, and we partnered with the University of Pittsburgh to do a pilot study with the University of Pittsburgh. Now, we did it in the Hill District. It's my neighborhood. This is the neighborhood in which our organization, my church, is located in. It's a predominantly Black neighborhood. It's an underserved neighborhood, medically underserved neighborhood in the city of Pittsburgh. And I suspected that we had a disproportionate experience of childhood trauma in this neighborhood. Now,
You getting trained?
14, the score, when you look at the ACE test, there was 14, excuse me, when you look at the ACE test, the score is 0 to 10. So 0 being the low scored, as in no childhood trauma, 10 being the high score. And the score the researchers pay attention to is a score of 4. So in other words, if you're taking the ACE test and you have a score of 4 or higher, it puts you at an elevated risk for a negative impact on adult health and behavior. 14% of Americans have a score of 4 or higher. 14%. I believe it's a staggering number. 14% of Americans have a score of 4 or higher. It's a staggering number. When we did a pilot study here in our neighborhood with the University of Pittsburgh, we found that 61% of respondents had a score of 4 or higher. And we did not even include these expanded ACEs in that original screening. Now, this is where we were able to scientifically validate that our suspicion was well-founded, that indeed we had a disproportionate experience of trauma. A lot of times people talk about trauma and they say, well, everybody's got trauma. And that's true. There's trauma in every community. And yet at the same time, we have to look at the rates of trauma. We have to look at the disproportionate experience of trauma. And along with that, we have to look at resilience in community. How able is a community to withstand that trauma or to bounce back from that trauma? Some communities have better resilience than others. Nonetheless, it's an important consideration. And when I speak and I share people about this example, quite often it's the case that people reflect on their own communities or the communities that they serve. Many people, like yourselves, are working in communities in which they are underserved communities, or perhaps the communities of color, historically marginalized community. And people, they often tell me, I would imagine that these statistics are the same in my community. I would imagine that these statistics are the same in the community that I serve. Some of the rural white communities even, in the Commonwealth, we can imagine that there's a disproportionate experience of trauma in some of our communities. Of course, as we look at the risks, mental distress, asthma, depression, you would see income, unemployment, stroke, diabetes. These are of course the increased risk for a negative impact that I had referenced before. And of course, there are individual risk factors that come along with that. You'll see that these risk factors for the disproportionate impact of childhood trauma, you will see that they really are parental in many instances. Individual risk factors, parents' lack of understanding of child's needs, parents' history of child maltreatment, Of course, mental health issues, perinatal characteristics, such as young age, low education, large number of dependent children with a single parent, low income. It's interesting with this too. And I'm about to say something that's not scientifically established yet, but it's something that I suspect, and that's with the maternal mortality rate that we see. What's really so interesting about this is whenever we look at the maternal mortality rate among African-American women, we see that there is no improvement. So based on educational attainment. So that is to say that if a Black woman is low income, if she's coming from the housing projects, or if she has a PhD and is the dean of a university, she faces the same risk for maternal mortality. And so we look at this and we say, why is that? How could that be? How really could that be? And this is where, again, we have to look at, was there childhood trauma? What really was the condition that people grew up in, and how has that impacted adult health and behavior? You'll see non-biological transient caregivers in the home. There's an elevated risk for that if someone has experienced childhood trauma, okay? Of course, there's family risk, social isolation, family disorganization, dissolution, and violence, intimate partner violence, and then parenting stress. This is very real, okay? And then finally, community factors, community risk factors, no big surprises here. Community violence, concentrated neighborhood disadvantage, and poor social connections. Social capital is quite significant. And as we all know, there's a lot of people who get opportunities simply because they know someone. I mean, if we're going to be real about it, we're going to go to universities, and we're not saying that there's always the best and brightest in universities. Sometimes it's just because you know someone. And there's something very real about that for us as humans. Poor social connections. There's an increased risk factor. So if there's disproportionate experience of childhood trauma in a community, we can also then understand that there's going to be poor social connections as a result of that one generation later. So then we contrast that with then what are some protective factors? Now you'll see here, obviously, nurturing parenting styles. We know the stable family relationships, social networks, parental employment, adequate housing. Now, here's the thing, we really look at this, and a lot of times we like to say, well, as Americans, we're really big on, you got to take responsibility. There's some Americans that would say you got to pull yourself up by your bootstrap. If you really look at this and you say adequate housing, for example, access to healthcare, social services, these things in particular go beyond an individual. This goes beyond the disposition of an individual. This is where we have to say there are systemic realities that either help or hinder people in their ability to withstand the trauma that they've experienced. So here we have to look at, there's sort of a broader perspective. Just one interesting factor that comes out of all of this research in terms of community protective factors, because a lot of times people think about what community protective factors are the best. But what's really interesting, one thing that's really interesting about this body of research is that communities that support parents and take responsibility for preventing abuse, those communities seem to really do well in the face of trauma, withstanding trauma. So as a community, this is one of the things that's really kind of interesting to draw out. Supporting parents, right, and taking responsibility for preventing abuse. So again, what's so interesting about this is that this is really where we begin to see the best way to overcome the effects of childhood trauma is to really interrupt that cyclical nature of transgenerational trauma, where we have to say, now we know that we have had this disproportionate experience in community. We now know in this community that we have to put extra effort into our children now. We have to put extra effort into ensuring that our parents are parenting children now in a healthy way. We have to, as a community, do everything we can to prevent abuse. We talked about resilient PA and heal PA, and one of the things in heal PA that's so very important is this idea of prevention. prevention being a priority for all Pennsylvanians, that we want to prevent, we want to work as hard as we can to prevent trauma from happening in the Commonwealth. Now, so here we have to get into this notion of historical trauma and transgenerational trauma. Okay, and this is where we talk about trauma that's experienced in one generation can be passed down through preceding generations through parenting styles, storytelling, environment, and biology. And this is really, really interesting. This the initial work was done around Holocaust survivors. And these were the descendants of Holocaust survivors that were exhibiting characteristics of people who had been exposed to trauma, but they themselves were never exposed to that kind of trauma. It invited this deeper exploration into this notion of historical trauma and transgenerational trauma. There are communities, whole populations that have been through trauma as a population. So in the American context, we can think of certainly the African-American experience. We think about chattel slavery, and we think of what this one group of people went through for hundreds of years. Certainly we can consider the Native American experience, where we have Native Americans who they went through genocide, as whole tribes went through genocide at points of their history. We can think even in Western Pennsylvania, for example, where we're in the Rust Belt, we can think even about, we just had Labor Day, of course, the labor abuses that happened to whole communities over that period. Those people that were dying in the mines, those people that were dying in the mills, those people that were being exploited, those families that were just trampled upon by corporate interests. This would be an example of community trauma that can somehow happen to a group of people that's passed down from one generation to the next. I'll tell you a very interesting anecdote that really illustrates this point and the power of this point. Joy DeGruy, in her work, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, tells this very interesting anecdote that she witnessed one day. And in this anecdote, she says that she was attending a basketball game and she was watching three mothers, two white mothers and one black mother, and they were watching their sons play basketball. And the two white mothers were bragging on their sons. The one white mother was saying, "Oh, he's so extraordinary, he's exceptional, he's a great athlete, he's a wonderful student." And the second white mother started, in response to that, bragging on her son, who was also an honor student, he was also an exceptional athlete. And both of them, after that exchange, turned to the black mother and said, "And I know that you're proud of your son also." The black son, who was also an honor student, who was also an exceptional athlete, who was really a very honorable young man by current standards. And the young black mother, much to Joy DeGruy's surprise, responded by saying, "Oh, you don't know the half of it. He doesn't listen to me. He doesn't pick up. He's ignorant." And she starts giving this litany of all of the things that are wrong with this young man, that incidentally are the characteristics of a normal teenager, as I'm told. My children are a little younger than that. People tell me I have something to look forward to, but this notion of a young man just being a teenager, and these are all the things, these are why she couldn't brag on her son. And this interaction really was curious to Joy DeGruy. She had seen it many times before. She wondered what really was the origin of it. And as a good sociologist, she really explored this parenting phenomenon and traced it down through the institution of slavery. What was so interesting was, what she found was that this parenting style was absolutely rooted in the institution of slavery. A slave was sold on average at least once in his or her lifetime, at least once. And of course, it's abhorrent for any of us to imagine what it must have been like on the auction block, on the slave market. It's beyond our experience, it's beyond our comprehension as modern Americans, many of us. And yet really go back and say, what was the characteristics, what was the criteria that these slave owners were looking for when they went to buy slaves off the auction block? And it's important to understand that they used to look at their backs. If there were whip marks on their backs, it meant that they were not a well-behaved slave. If a slave had no whip marks on his or her back, that's a good slave. So you want a slave that's well behaved. They want a slave that's very motivated, a hardworking slave. They want a slave who can pick things up quickly, not to be confused with intelligence, but a slave that can pick things up quickly. So as a result of this, these mothers on the plantation, they began to openly portray their children as being badly behaved, as being lazy, as being slow learners, because they believed if this is what these owners really thought of their children, they would never be sold away from them. What happens over hundreds of years is that what was once an adaptive parenting style to keep a family intact becomes now a maladaptive parenting style, where we begin now to raise children with the belief that they really can't be, or that they can't do, or that they really are poorly behaved, or that they really are less than. It's a parenting style that is a result of historical trauma that has been passed down now many generations through parenting styles. There are many, many things like this in communities that have a disproportionate experience of trauma, communities that have been through historical trauma. What is the result of this? It's an intergenerational cycle of trauma response. Now, this is powerful because if you really start to say, what is the result of this in community? It's an intergenerational cycle of trauma response. So we talk about denial, nightmares, substance abuse, unresolved, isolation, feeling numb, identifying with death. I remember years ago, there was a young man who, he was in his 20s, and he was telling me, he was in his early 20s, and he was telling me how his friends, his peer group, they were telling their mothers what they wanted their funerals to be like. Mom, we know we're not going to live long. This is what we want our funerals to be like. Young men in their 20s. Identification with death. Memory loss, hypervigilance. I once saw two men get into, threaten to kill each other over a jelly donut. And they got in a disagreement. There were, by the way, there were more than one jelly donut. They just both went for the same one at the same time. They exchanged words. It escalated until they both threatened to kill each other. And I pulled one of them aside. I knew them both quite well. I pulled the first one aside. I said, "What are you doing?" I knew he wasn't homicidal. And his response to me was, "Well, you know, this is how we do." And in other words, this is the appropriate cultural response to this scenario. That is hypervigilance. That is the result. That is an intergenerational cycle of trauma response, threatening to kill someone over a jelly donut. And of course, survivor guilt. And you'll find that our communities that have that are rooted in historical trauma, you'll find these characteristics all throughout these communities. This is where we want to introduce to you the idea of a trauma-affected community. And this is a term, a real term that we use in this work, trauma-affected community. And what we mean is that trauma is the primary lens through which the community sees the world. With this definition, we're going to make explicit the lived experience of trauma and meaning making in the context of the community. So in other words, trauma plays a central role in meaning making in these communities. These communities where trauma, there's a disproportionate experience of trauma. I always like to say in the Hill District, it's not that everybody's lost a son to gun violence. No, this is what I'm telling you here. This is no exaggeration. Not everybody here has lost a son to gun violence, but everybody knows somebody who has. Not everybody's been incarcerated, but everybody knows somebody who has. Not everybody's been evicted, but everybody knows somebody who has. That's no exaggeration. That is absolutely the truth. This is where we say the trauma goes beyond the personal experience of trauma and now becomes the collective experience of trauma that informs the worldview of the community. It informs the culture of the community, the way in which the community sees the world. It means that trauma becomes central in terms of that community's cultural meaning making, that trauma plays a central role in meaning making in this community. And you'll see this. You drive through communities and you'll see we have the murals to the people who have died early. We've got t-shirts. Yeah, during the pandemic, Young woman was making masks for all those who have been lost. We got flowers at telephone poles. We got candlelight vigils, etc. This is all evidence of that, where trauma is playing a major role in that cultural meaning making in the community. Okay. Obviously, we have to talk about there's complex interwoven web of systemic issues and variables influencing the disparities and overall well-being of community. That is to say that it's not just that the community's been through this trauma a long time ago. There are these variables that continue to cause suffering in the community. People aren't just talking about, well, slavery was bad. People are talking about, I'm losing my house now. People aren't talking about slavery was bad. People are talking about my communities being torn apart. People aren't talking about slavery is bad. People are talking about our sons are dying in the streets and slavery was horrible. So we have we're often in this case, it's not like we've resolved this historical trauma, but really the same issues, the same sort of perspective, the same paradigm that caused that trauma long ago continues to cause further trauma often in these instances. And of course, can be passed down through the generations, as the story I just previously mentioned, through that parenting style. And again, storytelling narratives. There are so many people who they tell stories about, for example, their grandfather or their great-grandfather was beaten in the Jim Crow era by police when he was registering to vote. And those stories told from one generation to the next, it carries that trauma through. That trauma carries through to previous generations. So here's what we have to understand. Trauma-affected community, a shared experience of suffering that characterizes the personal experiences of many in the community, okay? It's a shared experience of suffering, a shared experience of suffering that characterizes the personal experiences of many in the community. It's not a singular event, but a layering of traumas: chronic unemployment, crime, drugs, homelessness, hunger, abuse, poverty, brokenness, radical isolation. The community culture is informed first and foremost by trauma. You know, it's interesting because you put some people in a room and someone new shows up and they get really excited. Wow, someone new's here, or someone new moves in. Oh, we got new neighbors. That's exciting. Because from the perspective of some people, this could be, your new friend. You have something in common with them. So you're expanding your network. It's something exciting that can come from this relationship. But there are many people, whenever someone new comes in, they raise an eyebrow and say, who's this? I wonder what kind of mess they're bringing here. I know in some instances when people, in our community, when a new neighbor moves in the block, there's fear. I wonder what kind of neighbors they're going to be. Are they going to bring in some kind of mess that we don't want on this block? It's not healthy thinking. This is a kind of perspective that's rooted in trauma. This is the perspective, a worldview that's informed first and foremost by trauma. Okay, so trauma is the foundation upon which the community worldview is laid. So this is what we mean by trauma-affected community. And all of you, I really want to encourage you to really reflect on, are you serving trauma-affected communities? Is this really something that you could define in your work? Is this something that you could see, where we could even understand scientifically that we are in a trauma-affected community? So this leads us to a broader reflection on community development. And when I ask people, how do you define community development? I get many different answers, and it's a very curious thing why we give different answers when it comes to this. We should all agree on this. We should all know what we mean by community development. Many of us are in community spaces. We shouldn't give different answers. How do you define community development? And what I would say is that, generally speaking, in America, in the United States, there's really two things that people mean when they're talking about community development. This is just in my experience. And those two things are real estate. People are always talking about real estate. I go to a lot of development meetings, and we got architects and engineers. They do these charrettes. They always say, we want community input on the charrettes. I always think, are you asking me to grade you how well you draw? Because if that's the case, I will give you an A. And this is what we're talking about, these beautiful drawings of what our community should look like. Real estate, it's easy. You can really mobilize capital around real estate. It can be profitable. The second thing that people usually mean about community development in the United States is jobs, business, jobs. So usually when you talk to developers, those are the two things that they do. They real estate and jobs, that's what they do. Of course, both of them are oriented towards profit. This is the measure of success, is the profit that comes from this. Now, we know that obviously you do need real estate. We know obviously that you do need jobs, that you do need business. The challenge, however, is that this perspective on development is very, very narrow and absolutely neglects the challenges that really prevent many people from capitalizing off of the development, many people from participating in the opportunities that result from the development. And in fact, if you go to many parts of the world, if you say, we want to talk about development, they are going to talk about real estate. They are going to talk about jobs. They're also, however, going to talk about healthcare. They're also going to talk about water quality. They're also going to talk about education. How do we talk about development without talking about education? Okay, so there's a much more holistic understanding of what community development is. Okay, and so this is a definition that that I really like, that helps maybe frame our perspective on community development. It's a process. So community development is a process where community members come together to take collective action and generate solutions to common problems. Community well-being, economic, social, health, environmental, and cultural, often evolves from this type of collective action being taken at a grassroots level. Okay, so we see it's a process. We see it's where community members come together to take collective action, generating solutions to common problems. This process, if it's not trauma-informed, is not going to be very inviting for people who have significant trauma history. This is where we're going to say, well, community development is fine. What though is trauma-informed community development? Now we're talking about a process. We're talking about a process that's trauma-informed. This is different than we're just going to have these community meetings and sign people up. A lot of these meetings, they're set up for failure. People are already angry when they come in the meeting. People are already, there's already a lack of transparency before the meetings ever begin. They ask people to sign up and they use the attendance of those meetings as a way to communicate some kind of community endorsement of these plans that are ultimately created without community participation. And of course, it's very challenging for people to cut through the emotions that this kind of process often evokes. Going back to the history of urban renewal and much of the root shock that has resulted from urban renewal. So if we really take this, okay, you see community well-being and it evolves into collective action at a grassroots level, right? This is the easiest way that we could say it. The goal of community development is community well-being. Now, brothers and sisters, I'm going to say this to you. If we don't understand this as communities, then we failed. If we go into a process of community development and people say, we're going to develop this community and they can't say this, then if we say, what is the goal of this community development? If they don't understand its community well-being, they shouldn't be stewards of it. Community development, the goal of community development is community well-being. In this work for us, that's exactly what we know. If community development is a process, it's a process that must be trauma-informed. Understanding that people in these trauma-affected communities have a disproportionate experience of trauma. And as a result, have to be engaged through a process that is trauma-informed, that results in community well-being. Now, a reflection on resilience. Resilience is also a process. I often think if we had half as many resilience experts in our communities as we have trauma experts in our community, my Lord, we'd be in a much better place. All these trauma experts running around, brothers and sisters, we need resilience experts, and we need to understand what resilience is. There's a very simple definition of resilience. It's an ongoing social process. So what's important to understand is that resilience can be built. Resilience can be built. It can be built. It also can be diminished. It's not, there are certainly attributes that we have by virtue of nature. That's certainly true. But nurture gives us a lot as well. In other words, resilience, we know the science around resilience is that we can build it through an ongoing social process. We can also measure how far along we are in building resilience in the person and what I believe the community as well. It's an ongoing social process enacted through, listen to this, ordinary practices of everyday life. We try to think about how do you build resilience? I situated in people's local context that enabled them to achieve favorable outcomes in relatively unfavorable situations. So the one example I always think of is, ordinary practices. How do you build resilience with ordinary practices? If there are any Marines on the call, you will know that in Marine Corps boot camp, as I'm told, I'm not a Marine, I was in the Army, of course, but in Marine Corps boot camp, that you're not allowed to put your boot on a box or a stool to tie it. So, sometimes you're going to tie your shoe, you put it up on and to tie it to make it easier to get to. You're not allowed to do that. Now, this is a very simple act. But you say, well, why are they doing this? Why are the Marines say you can't do this? Just to be difficult? But it's actually resilience building exercise. They do this because they know that in combat, it is quite often the case where you won't be able to sit down. You won't be able to put your feet up to put your boots on. They know that you might even have to put your boots on in the middle of the night because a firefight breaks out or something like that. So they're training them to put their boots on in a very nimble way. It's a simple, ordinary practice of everyday life that becomes life-saving resilience. And there are many instances like that. Okay, they're situated in people's local context. It enables them to achieve favorable outcomes in relatively unfavorable situations. I often think about the civil rights movement. It's in our mission statement, of course. And what's so very interesting is that people often think, oh, well, the civil rights movement just happened. In fact, there was an extraordinary infrastructure that prepared people to be agents of positive change. So Rosa Parks, she wasn't just tired. She just didn't want to it wasn't she was tired. She didn't want to give up her seat on the bus. That's the story they tell us. Rosa Parks was trained. She was a graduate of the Highlander Institute. Rosa Parks was the secretary of the NAACP. Rosa Parks was selected by the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to be the one who would refuse to give up her seat that day so that they could implement the bus boycott, which they have been planning for many months. This is, we had this vast infrastructure across the South. We had the freedom schools, the citizenship schools, the Highlander Institute, the nonviolent training centers in Nashville, Tennessee. And that was all to help develop people, to help them become agents of positive change. You say, how did they do those sit-ins when people were pouring coffee and milk on people and they were spitting on them and they were hitting them? Because they built the resilience in order to do that. And yet sometimes we want change in our communities without having that intentionality, that resilience building intentionality, that development to help people really build resilience. Okay, we want to go from trauma-affected community to resilient, healing, and healthy community. And this is where we understand community resilience as being a measure of the sustained ability of a community to utilize available resources to respond to, withstand, and recover from adverse situations. Okay, so now we're talking about a community's ability to have the community's ability to sustain, have a sustained response to trauma, to utilize available resources, respond to, withstand, and recover from adverse situations. Now, I want to say that COVID did not hit all communities equally. In some of our communities, we had 2 to 3 times the death rate and hospitalization rate that we had in other communities. This is because some communities lack resilience. Interestingly, communities that were formerly redlined. So we know now there is an absolute correlation between communities that were redlined, that is to say that were intentionally divested of in the 1930s and 40s because they were Black. Those formerly redlined communities, there's an absolute correlation between that redlining in the 30s and the hospitalization and death rates of COVID-19. We know that scientifically now to be true. So that is to say that community resilience does matter. Other communities didn't fare so badly with COVID because they had resilience that were there. So what we want to say in trauma-informed community development, we want to work to facilitate transformation from a trauma-affected community to resilient, healing, and healthy community. So this is from the Carbon Institute. These are 6 foundations of community resilience that I think are very, very important. People, you have to have people. The power to envision the future of the community and build its resonance resides with community members. So if you're trying to do this without working with people, without developing people, you will not be able to. Like I referenced the civil rights movement, that infrastructure to develop people. Secondly, systems thinking. You have to be able to understand, communities have to be able to understand complex interrelated crises now unfolding what they mean for our similarly complex communities. Now you're going to get into community arguments around gun violence and people are going to say, this is the reason why the violence is happening. They got one reason they're putting forward. That's not good because it's a complex issue. You need to be able to foster that systems thinking and say, what are all of the issues? How do you do that? Through a process that really draws that out. Adaptability. Obviously, a community has to be able to adapt and being able to adapt. I know in Western Pennsylvania, what we're so bad at is we say, well, in the steel days, this is the way it was. Well, you know what? Steel's gone, and it ain't coming back. So we better adapt because we're just going to keep talking about the old days. We're not going to get anywhere. And there's many communities that fall into that trap. Transformability, okay, right? Every challenge is an opportunity. Now you got to do that. That takes intentionality. You got to have a team that can look at every challenge and to help people understand how it's an opportunity and then capitalize on that opportunity. Certainly sustainability. There's a lot to be said for this. That certainly talks about resources. It talks about how deep your bench is. If you got one really great charismatic leader and then that leader falls out, that's the end of it, right? You got to talk about how deep your bench is. You have to talk about what kind of the quality of your network, of your social network, social capital, right? This is all falls under sustainability, the ability to keep it going. And finally, courage, a very intangible virtue. We don't talk a lot about virtue anymore. I really wish that that people read that we did a better job of Aristotle and Plato. And I know there's a push to establish classical schools in our communities, and I strongly support that because this notion of virtue is of extreme importance, and we have to reflect on what this means. St. Basil the Great, there are many who wrote about virtue. We have to incorporate this into our communities and foster it, honor it, and raise it up. These are just some Dr. Howard Pinderhughes from California, some things that he talks about, some bullet points about community resilience. I won't get into this because our time's running short. On a personal level, helping people understand self-care skills, coping strategies, a supportive network, and a sense of competence. Now listen, there's so much to be said. You could have whole courses on this, resilience. We're just giving a very brief overview. Self-care skills, coping strategies, supportive network, sense of competence. This is how we build resilience on a personal level. There's much to be said for all of this. So in our closing minutes, I hope to be done here in the next 2 minutes or so, consultative workshop. This is a process we learned from the World Health Organization in 2014. We implemented it in our community, where we set up a tent and we brought people from the community together. We had academicians and researchers and clinicians, and we problematized this issue of community trauma. It's built on the premise, this process, that a lot of times people don't make progress in communities because they try to solve issues. Issues don't have solutions, problems do. So if you say, what are we gonna do about gun violence? I don't know. What are you gonna do about education? I don't know. But within these issues, there are multiple problems that once we identify them, we can take action to address. we did this exercise to problematize the issue of community trauma. And from this emerged this framework, trauma-informed community development. And we say, as informed by the lived experience of trauma, both personal and collective. Now, here I want to say that many of us know our elders, our ancestors suffered immense trauma. I just published a book on this, suffered immense trauma, and yet in that trauma exhibited extraordinary resilience. Who among us is going to say that Harriet Tubman wasn't resilient? Who among us is going to say that Frederick Douglass wasn't resilient? Okay, there's this lived experience of trauma. There's wisdom to be found. There's beauty. Some of the most extraordinary things I've ever heard or seen in my life were from people who are uneducated, but have suffered greatly. So we want to build on that wisdom that comes from the trauma. We want to say, in addition to that, it's a framework. Trauma-informed community development is a framework. It's not a program, not a model. It's a framework. And we like to say there's freedom within a framework. In other words, houses look different, but you use a hammer to build every house. So you got to learn how to use a hammer. Houses look different, but you use a saw to build every house. So you got to learn how to use a saw. Houses look different, but you use CAD design to design the house, CAD software to design the house. So you got to learn how to use CAD software. In other words, you can learn a framework, but there's freedom in that framework. It's a framework that establishes and promotes resilient, healing, and healthy communities so that people can be healthy enough to sustain opportunities and realize their potential. There's so much more that I want to share. The Neighborhood Resilience Project, I just want to jump right here to the end. The Neighborhood Resilience Project, located in Pittsburgh, has really taken on this work. I just want to say, in terms of what can you do, educate people in your community. Train people in your community. There's a difference between education and training. Education, you're talking about raising awareness. You want to train people. After you raise awareness, give them the skills. You've got to organize. If there's not, I would argue that many of the protests of this summer of 2020 accomplished little in the long run because there was no real organization. They were just executed via social media, no real organization, which then meant there's no real plan. Once you organize, you've got to plan, equip. You're going to need the right resources, the right tools to accomplish, and then deploy. So often in the community, we just start with deploy, and people fail unnecessarily. So I want to thank you for your time here today. Please, you can go to our website, neighborhoodresilience.org. And I truly, truly encourage all of you, continue in your work. There's so much more that we can do together as a Commonwealth.
All right, Father Paul, you touched something, I'm sure, in each of us. If none of us, I know you touched something in me deep. And so I see your 6 foundational ideas that are needed. From the premise of real healing to take place, there must be, number one, for me, an admission that there is a problem. Okay? The belief that healing is possible for these communities, and patience, then being able to recover, that what has been lost can be recovered from the people inside these communities. So here's my question. There may be others, and we'll get to those. What were the biggest challenges for getting your work in the Pittsburgh area moving forward? How did you bridge the gap of distrust that was prevalent there? I'm sure, because new people coming in, even like the neighbor next door, I don't trust you. You're just another program. And who maintains and sustains the work that you started?
Wow, Ramona, these are really wonderful questions. So to your first one, what were some of the challenges? So I'd say really twofold challenges. There were challenges all around. Firstly, on let's say the more on the system side of things, here's where really the challenge, because to do this kind of work requires resources. And what was so very interesting was early on in the work, I did experience some pushback from systems. And the pushback was essentially, who qualified you to do this work? And, you know, it was a difficult question to hear. I mean, I'm an educated man, as many of us are. I do value education greatly. I value training and certification greatly. And I also knew that there were many instances where people that the system was sending into the community with qualifications were actually doing harm. And it was a disturbing question because I thought, really, are you asking me who qualified me to do work in my own community? And I thought, I could ask you the same. Who qualified you to do work in our community? And I realized they all qualified themselves. You know, it's very interesting because if you look at the community health worker evolution of things, we had community health workers years ago. And at that particular time, there was no certification for that. And we partnered with UPMC. We learned a lot. We just developed our own curriculum and obviously with their input and we're training community health workers. And all of a sudden now there's a state certification for a community health worker. And it's just, it's one of those things where it's, it just unintentionally perhaps takes the ability of community members, takes away the ability of community members to really making an impact in their communities. And this was that very same kind of thing. So, you know, there's a phrase in the trauma-informed world that I absolutely love. It's that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. You don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. And this is what I just started really trying to communicate. Now, things have changed significantly, whereas now, Department of Human Services here in Allegheny County just put out an RFP for the proposals for what they call non-traditional mental health support. Because there's people in our communities that have been doing this. They're not therapists, but they've been being therapeutic for generations, honestly. And so that was a big challenge. On the community side, of course, the big challenge was, are you going to do what you say you're going to do? Now, how do we overcome that? I remember early on, there was a woman who listened to me in the community. She's a community leader, and she listened. She was very kind. She was a Christian woman, very kind, faithful woman. She's very, very protective of the community at the same time. And she said to me, it sounds like what you want to do is really, really nice. And since you're here to help, since you want to help, I've got this niece that got 4 children and none of them have beds. So why don't you take care of that? And I understood that what she was really saying was, you now, if you want me to trust me, you've got to demonstrate that you can be trusted. I call this demonstrated trustworthiness. So people talk about trustworthiness. So in this work, we talk about demonstrated trustworthiness. So I knew that I had to buy the beds. That wasn't an option. I couldn't go to the board and say, guys, we didn't budget for this. I can't do this. I knew that what I had to do was purchase those beds because she was trying to see if my word was good. And after all, if we're going to talk about community development on a really broad scale and we got children sleeping on the floor, I would argue that beds are community development. I would argue that. And so that was very important. Kind of leads into your second question. How did we kind of get past the trust? It was very challenging early on, but really, we took every opportunity we could to spend money early on so that we can show people that we are going to make with just a little bit of money, you can make an extraordinary impact. You can really build trust with just a little bit of money. And you got to spend resources. You can't just say, trust me. If someone says to you, I don't have any heat because my furnace is not working, you can say, I hear you, or you can buy them a new furnace. That's really saying, I heard you. And we did a lot of that stuff early on. And that's how we helped build that trust. And then thirdly, how do we sustain this work? And that's where leadership development it's one of our pillars. It's one of the pillars we have in this work. So just like the civil rights movement, which again informs our work, we know that we've got to develop leaders. So with all the interventions that we do, we have what we call micro community interventions, for example, where we're taking blocks at a time and taking them through an extensive year-long intervention process. We always train and raise up a leadership team in that process. And whenever we move on, we leave an Indigenous leadership team in our wake. We also have an institute that we run, not just for people locally, But we have cohorts now from across the country. We've had a number of them from Pennsylvania who have come through a week-long intensive training in this trauma-informed community development framework. And we train people as behavioral health community organizers. We train people as trauma responders for homicides and gun violence. And that training is very important because that training is how we're building up a network of leadership. And that's how this is going to be sustainable. It's just going to be dependent on us, on me personally. It's not going to survive. But if we can build up a core of leadership that's quite extensive, that reaches across the community more broadly, then we can have sustainability. And ultimately, if we leave in place the processes that really continue to develop that leadership in community, then I believe, again, we have a sustainable future.
Thank you, Father Paul. I was going to ask you if you had training opportunities, but you did mention that you do have a significant leadership training for community leaders, how to get this started. Is that something that we can get access to just to know what's available to us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So if you neighborhoodresilience.org, if you kind of it's join the movement. So if you click on join the movement, and if you have any question as to is the training right for you or your team, you can certainly through the website set up an exploratory conversation and learn more. But on the website, you can check it out. As I'd mentioned, we've had cohorts from obviously Pittsburgh, Crawford County, Lancaster, Richmond, Petersburg, Virginia, Kansas City, Indianapolis. We've had several Arapaho cohorts from Wind River Indian Reservation, in fact, Sarasota, Florida, New Britain, Connecticut. So we have with predominantly Black populations, Hispanic, Native American, and also we've had a number of white cohorts come through from white communities that have a disproportionate experience of trauma. I believe very strongly that you absolutely can make a community-wide impact as a result of this trauma. It requires just a little bit of training and mentoring, and with the right guidance and plan and resources, you can really make an impact here. The final thing I'll say on that is that we have designed with the university in partnership with the University of Pittsburgh, a health assessment tool called I Am Healthy. And this I Am Healthy gives us the ability to measure the health and well-being of the person, household, block, and ultimately neighborhood. And this is the tool that we've used to validate our work. What we've seen as a result of these interventions, health and well-being is improving in our community. And so I believe very strongly that you can absolutely measure the impact of this, and that with the right tools, with the right health assessment system, you can know and communicate. Because sometimes when people make progress, they don't really know that they're making progress. As you're doing this work, there's going to be bad things that are going to happen. And in the midst of that, you have to be able to communicate that the community is making progress. So that assessment does matter. And it's something that we use to help inform and mobilize these communities to keep going, to continue in their efforts.
I keep checking to make sure there's no questions in the chat. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand, or I'm just going to keep asking questions. So if you have questions, please don't let me dominate, because I am full of questions in this area. I'll keep looking. If you would look for me too, Amanda, but I do have another question while she's letting me know. Question, did you all measure the effect of trauma-informed community, this work you're doing, on gun violence in your neighborhoods?
That's a great question. So we've measured on the effect that we've measured it on is specifically health and well-being. So that's what we're looking at. Now, what I will say is that gun violence, we are very involved in the gun violence issue here as a result of our work, not just in our neighborhood, but across Allegheny County. And what I can say is that although the areas that we're working in, we've seen a decrease in gun violence, we don't have the same, we haven't put it through the same scientific scrutiny as we have just looking at health and well-being to say that it is the result of these interventions. So it's certainly further exploration that we need to do. The one thing I will say about gun violence is that a lot of research around gun violence and what really is effective, a lot of times we approach gun violence very much with, violence interrupters, trying to interrupt the violence, and we know that's very effective, and indeed it is. We also, I think, have to understand that there are these deeper drivers of gun violence. Remember, it is a very complex issue. I think it is that sort of cyclical trauma response that we talked about, and environment heavily impacts trauma as well. So what I would say is that we need to, in order to address gun violence adequately, we need short-term interventions, which I think we're starting to do more of. But I think there also needs to be long-term interventions where we have to say, look, if there's an area that has a concentrated gun violence, which is quite often the case, then we need to really saturate that area with trauma-informed community development. I mean, we need to really take a trauma-informed approach to developing that area of the community, because ultimately that trauma-informed community development process is going to get at the drivers, these deep drivers of the gun violence that are rooted in historical transgenerational trauma.
I have a question here from Terry Lee Rose. Do you work with the fractured urban indigenous community here in Pennsylvania?
I do not. I'm so sorry to say. I do not. And from the question, sounds like I should.
I know, sounds very interesting. And
it does.
Then I have another question. I'm trying to get down to it. Christina Regal asked, are there any recommendations for resources and or sources of support for addressing trauma and utilizing trauma-informed care in a school setting?
That's a really wonderful question. And I think there's a number of resources that are available now. Without really mentioning specifically one, I would say that, for example, HEAL PA has a subcommittee that's really focused specifically on education, school-based trauma, and I think that would be a very appropriate place for Pennsylvanians to begin to really engage, to reach out to HEAL PA and specifically try to reach out to the education action team. They have done a great job of cataloging what resources are available. I know that Resilient, I can't speak for Resilient PA, I believe so, but certainly HEAL PA, but we are really focused on trauma-informed schools, trauma-informed education. It's mentioned, in fact, in the Trauma-Informed Pennsylvania plan that many of you may be familiar with, that came out in 2020. And so that's where actually I would encourage, because there's certainly national resources out there, I would encourage you, if you have an interest in that, to reach out to that action team and really get a sense of what as a state we're making available.
You know, interesting you say reach out to the HEAL PA, which is, I believe, a state. And so I have a question from Melanie Kessler, who says, how would you suggest state agencies engage with communities who have dealt with systemic trauma?
That's such a wonderful question. I think that what's very important to do is to really find a strong community partner. That's going to be actually seminal. In other words, if you say as a state agency, I want to just engage the broader community, that's probably not wise, I would say. We're a state agency, we're going to engage the broader community. Just don't start there like that. I would say, look, we want to engage this particular community. Who are some community leaders, community-based organizations, community champions that we can actually have these one-on-one meetings and work to really build relationship with. And I think the most effective way to then really engage the community is collaboratively. When that consultative workshop that I referenced back in 2014, we did that partnership with Duquesne University, and there were folks from University of Pittsburgh that also participated. I remember we had to we had to get people to sign the research forms. And that was a really difficult, a very tense moment, that the morning of that exercise, because people were like, wait, we got a white researcher that just asked us to sign these papers. And I actually had to stand up on the stage and say, listen, I believe this is important. This is something that we're going to ensure is to the benefit of the community. I'm going to be the first one to sign it. And I remember thinking that when I said that, I said, I sure hope these guys don't mess this up, because I'm gonna have to move if it goes bad. But anyways, I said that, and of course it turned out quite well. But if I had not been there to say that, the conversation wouldn't have progressed. So I think what we need to do is to start to say, look, we're going to sit down and we're going to do this together. Okay. I'm not just going to engage the Kings of State Agency, but it's going to be the state agency and Neighborhood Resilience Project. It's going to be the state agency and, whatever organization that we're going to actually do this, or state agency and this collaborative group of organizations. And that's how we're going to do this. I think was a I think is a much better way to approach that kind of community-wide engagement.
Thank you. I do see a raised hand. Mr. Kenneth Thompson, I see that raised hand.
Thank you so much. And hello, Father Paul. How are you? It's good to see you.
Dr. Thompson, always a pleasure.
So I really appreciated this talk. It's been fantastic. And I just wanted to think just for a second about the reframe that trauma has brought to the work. In the past, the focus would have been on poverty. The focus would have been on lack of, there just isn't, or scarcity. Now I think that this takes a much more, sadly, because people have had to live through it, but it's much more focused on the persons and not just the material. Kind of your points about, not just the bricks and mortar, but how people relate. But nonetheless, the scarcity is still there. That right. The absence of resources is still there. And one of the things that I know that can do is just make it really hard. The two guys reaching for the one jelly donut, right? Even though there might have been others around, that's the one they wanted. In their minds, it's a scarce commodity. How have you seen the trauma-informed work get behind and beyond the struggle that always goes on when there are limited resources and people are trying to compete with each other for them, in terms of figuring out how to, to make take those resources and use them in a way that everybody can see the pie grow, or the resources of the community develop, or you discover there's more abundance than you thought there was. Is it helping with that?
I love that question, Dr. Tom. I mean, it's just such an important question. And it's one that you have to consider when doing this work, because certainly that scarcity does matter. For us in this work, what we know is that, so there's one thing that's very clear, and this is probably one of the more difficult things to communicate in this work, that not everybody has the same level of need. So that is to say that if you do this work collectively, there could be somebody at the table that actually needs a lot more than someone else at the table. So this idea, like if we take $100 and we're just going to split it evenly among the group, that's not how we operate. The way we operate is if we have $100, we're going to try to really understand the need of people. And we're going to try to leverage that money in a way that helps address those needs. And we also understand that there are some needs that actually are a higher priority than other, let's say, quote unquote, needs. And we have to help people understand that. And yet at the same time, what we always want to, the culture we're trying to build is that if my brother or my sister wins, I win also. Now, if that's the culture we're trying to build, there's the reality of is, why'd she get this and I didn't get that? I mean, the worst is if we're doing like this work and they got a roof that's fallen in, and we get them a brand new roof, and then there's somebody else that they got 2 steps that are falling out, and we replace the 2 steps. There's a huge difference between what a new roof costs and what it costs to fix 2 steps, and really having to explain that to people. And yet at the same time, what we have to do is, this is where we have to do work. It's that community building work. So I want to say very, very clearly that there are things that you can do to intentionally build community. It's not something that you just have to hope happens. But there really is part of this intervention. We work to intentionally build community so that we can, with this community, with the culture that we build in this community, can actually withstand the process of resource distribution. That's how I would describe it. The community you have to build has to be able to withstand the process of distribution, number one. Number two, we're very transparent. So at the very beginning, we say, look, not everybody's going to get the same thing, okay? We just have to know that going into this. And I think that if we start with this idea that everybody's going to get the same thing, and then we change to, well, you're going to get this and you're going to get that, then that's going to create some anger. But if we tell them up front, and we do, we say, we just want to tell you, not everybody's getting the same thing. And you know this is true because we were on that block last year, and you know that woman got a new roof and this woman got a new window. One's more expensive than the other, but they both got what they needed. Mm-hmm. And because they both got what they needed, we all win. And it's trying to really build that. You know, if you look at the civil rights movement, again, not to keep referencing that, but how extraordinary it is. I mean, people, they're getting chewed up by dogs. They're getting arrested, sprayed with water cannons, and many of them wouldn't even live long enough to see the benefit of their sacrifice. That's the truth of it. Many of them. I've been to. I know, Dr. Thompson, you and I have talked a lot about Antietam in the past, and I can think of being at Gettysburg and that story of the 2nd Massachusetts, where they were ordered to make that assault, and they said it's murder, but we'll do it anyway. So this notion of sacrifice, and one of the things, not to I believe in self-care. I want to say that outright. You got to take care of yourself. At the same time, we talk about self-care a lot more than we talk about self-sacrifice. For us in this work, we have to talk about sacrifice. This is in the spirit of our ancestors, because that's what they talked about. They'll say, if you ever look, there's this beautiful commitment card of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And it says to commit to this, I hereby pledge myself and my body to be used for the nonviolent movement so that all men could be free. I mean, so that has to be baked into the culture of the community that we're building. And that culture has to withstand the distribution of resources, okay? Won't be maybe equal, but God willing, it will be fair. And in the end, we'll all be better off as a result of it. But it's tough work, Doc. That's the right question for sure.
Yeah. Well, you all, we have come probably to, we got about 3 minutes, 2 minutes. I'm going to ask Amanda just to share at the very end one thing that stood out for her today, but after the end of that, we're going to be closing out. But again, I want to thank you, Father Paul. I want to thank every one of you for taking the time out of your day for us, for this commitment to heal, to empower, advocate, learn, prevent, and act on behalf of those who suffer the impacts of trauma in our communities. Father Paul, you're my new hero. Because you give yourself selflessly to this act, and I know it's impacting the communities in which you operate. So thank you very much. And again, thank you for your service. Amanda, what's the one thing that stood out for you today?
I mean, besides the fact that Father Paul is probably one of the most inspirational speakers I think I have heard probably ever around trauma-informed care, I think the biggest standout point to me is it really all comes back to creating not just equity, but inclusion and belonging in our communities. I love that point that you made, and I have been thinking about it with every word Father Paul said, that we have to change how we talk about things and not identify people as problems, but identify people as the solution and the whole reason we're here to serve our communities and elevate people up. And I just love that. I think that's my favorite part of listening to this presentation today. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of it.
Again, thank you all. We have your information, and we hope to get slides out if slides are available, and get information out to you so we can continue to have these conversations. Again, thank you, Father Paul. Thank all of you guys. Have a good day.
Thank you all.